before. Anyone? Okay, well, in this session, we're going to focus mostly on how it can be used, what it can do, and then later sessions, if you decide to use it, we'll show you how to set it up so that you can use it in a course. So, did I start the recording? Yes, I did. Okay, sorry, it's been a long week, 2 weeks. So what I'd like you to do first is to get your own copy of it. First, join iClicker Cloud as a student. If you have an instructor account, you can then log into a student account and using the same credentials, just choose login as a student. If you don't have any account, create one using your SUNY Oswego email address as an instructor and then log out and come back in. Now you can do that on a web app, so you can do it right in a browser by going to iClicker.cloud. Or actually, if you, let me put the link for this in the chat. I meant to do that. Where is the link? Well, actually, let me just put that in the chat because that will take you there. If you're on a mobile device, you can directly download the app. And for this, I'd encourage you to download both the, okay, thank you. You can download both the student app and the instructor app so you can experiment with it. Because the best way to see how it works and so forth is just to try it. And that's what we'll mostly be doing today. So if you go to that address, if you click on that on a, well, click on that in chat, it'll take you right to it. And then you can just choose log in first as an, or create an account as an instructor, basically set up just like any other instructor account, but log in using your SUNY Oswego email account because we do have a license for it here at Oswego. And when you log in as a member of the oswego.edu domain, it doesn't cost you anything. The college is paying, but when the college pays for it, it pays based on the number of students that are using it, and instructors are free. So create that instructor account first, and then exit out, log in as a student. If you're doing it right on the web browser, again, once you have created your account, you can just choose sign in as a student or an instructor when you go to iClicker.com. Is that working?
John, they're asking for a join code.
Okay, that will be that should be the REMX.
Yeah, I've tried that. That's not working.
Okay, well then let's go on to the next slide and then it should no. Okay, let me try it again. Oh, I know why. Because I didn't start the app. I was a little time crunched here today. I had to take down everything in the other room and I didn't quite. I was kind of hoping the grad student would would have stuck around for that. So let me start the app and then it'll generate the code and you'll see it on the screen in just a minute. I'm right now, what happens once you have it on your computer, when you click on it, we'll do this. After you've created your account, you would then sign in. And again, you got to put your information in. So, and come on, there we go. And then there we go. Okay, so I created this for the workshop here. And so when I start the class, it's going to pop up. And in here, when I do where is the join? Oh, why is that not working? It worked last time I did it. Let me see what happens. It should be just the REMX. And we didn't find a class. Okay, that's my mistake. I thought I tested this last night, and apparently I messed up. 1 second. Um,
I have a question. I'm trying to,
Sure, go ahead.
yes, I'm trying to create my account, but I don't see Sony Oswego, but I can see Sony College at Oswego. Is that the correct institution?
If if you type, okay, it'll ask you what your institution is. Just
Yeah.
type in Oswego and it should come up with State University of New York and Oswego.
No, I said University of New York College at Oswego. Is that one?
Yes, that
Okay,
would be
thank
it.
you. Yeah, thank
Okay. So I had to go into I'm not sure what happened. That account was working last night. I swear it was. I have to log in on the web browser and change the settings because apparently I made a small tweak this morning and apparently that broke it. And this has never happened to me before. It's normally really straightforward. Really, it is, even though it may not appear that way in a moment. Okay, so I'll show you what happened, what went wrong. Apparently, this was an account, this was something I had created before, and what I have to do, oh, because I started it, let me exit end class, and okay, I am no longer in that class, except it, okay. So I'm going to go to settings and see what the join code should be. Um, Oh, it has changed. Okay, let me try this link. So I'm going to drop this link into chat. When I made some tweaks to it this morning to extend the date because it was going to expire today, and I didn't want it to expire in the middle of this, that's still the wrong one. I'm going to copy that link again. And this, it's not this hard for students because they're automatically put into classes, by the way. And the other thing you could do is you could download a code if you were doing it for just one event or something like this. And this is what Rebecca did yesterday or 2 days ago when we, oh, which one is it? I've been doing a lot of this recently. Here we go. So you could also share the QR code. It's one of those days. Okay. So I just extended the date because it was going to end right now. So now that QR code should work. So if you're asked for the code, just use that WAKO and I will fix that on here. One more time. I'm going to copy, paste that. I'm not doing so well today. Apparently I copied too much. Okay. And there was no K in there. And now this should work. There we go. Okay. So now, but I have to restart the app because I did just exit from it. And that's hidden down here because that magically switched from one screen to the other. So once you have this set up, you would just go into the classroom. Once you have your account, you would go into the classroom, pop it up, it would load on the screen, and then it would list any of the classes you're using for it. This is the one I was using this fall. And I've got to create a new one for my spring class, which I'll be doing later today as a way of demonstrating how to do that. And now, once it's done, if you want to use it for any questions or in class, you just put the slide, whatever question you want to ask, you just display on the screen. That could be in PowerPoint, Google Slides, any other slide presentation software, because what it will do is it will take whatever is on the screen and capture that, and that becomes the question, and that gets shared out to devices if you choose to share it. So what we're going to do is and this is all going, I'm going to set this to anonymous. So we're going to go here. I'm going to do a poll. I'm going to choose to make it anonymous. Okay. And so now I'm just going to have everyone just type something in just to show how it works. And again, we saw this at the academic affairs retreat. And what should have happened is it should still be on the screen and I should be seeing the results. There it is. There. Okay. So now this is what happens when you're viewing it. It'll look a little different if it's not anonymous. And you'll see the number of responses count up as people type something in. And you can type anything. We're not going to keep any of these results for any reason. But let's just get one or two responses and just type anything into it. I suppose I should ask, was everyone able to connect to the class using a WAKO code?
And I'm needing to set up an account or something like that. So
Okay. Well, we'll leave this running. So yeah, you do have to create the account, and that's the most work. Students don't have to do that. Basically, once it shows that they have an oswego.edu address, it will connect to them and will ask them what the school is. They type that in, and then it'll ask them to choose their courses from the menu. So it's a little bit easier, I think, for them because they're automatically put into the class. Here, sharing this code this way is something we don't have to do with those students. They can pretty much automatically find it. Is anyone else able to connect to the class? We've got one response.
I'm creating my account. They're asking me instructor remote ID. Oh, it is optional. Yes, I don't need to put the ID.
Yeah, you can ignore the remote ID. That dates back
Yeah,
to when everyone was using physical clickers. It's very rare that anyone uses them anymore. But on the back of the physical clicker, there was a remote ID, which allowed a handheld device to serve as a remote control where you could turn
Okay.
clickers on or off, or you could start or stop the polling. We pretty much all stopped that by the pandemic when we moved to the
Okay.
remote access. How's it going, Scott? Able to connect?
I think I'm in.
Okay,
I
you
think
should
I
see
sent an
the.
answer in.
Oh, well, I'm only seeing one response. You may have to click submit or something.
Well, I thought I got an answer received.
Oh, okay. Oh, there. Well, maybe it was just a little delay. Okay.
Okay.
And so I'll stop that. Usually I use a countdown, but for something like this, it's easier this way. And then if I want to see the results, I can display them. So one is hello, and the other is all the potential technology I need to learn. This turns out to be really easy, especially after the first time or two. And if you have a lot of responses, with two of them, it wouldn't be very useful. You could generate a word cloud, and Rebecca did that just to show the pattern of responses. What some of these systems do now is they'll generate AI summaries. It's not there yet for this, but I'm hoping that'll be soon. Some people have built tools that will collect the responses and generate a summary, but we don't have access to those, at least not at this point. Now, what I would normally do, by the way, is when I'm running this, I would be running the controls either on my phone or an iPad or on a second screen if there's two displays, where I would let the questions all appear here, but I would be watching the responses as they come in. Because if you click this little thing here, well, if you click the results, you can bring that box out and you can watch the responses come in on a second screen. And that way you can see how students are doing. Because one of the things when you ask questions is you'll often decide what to do at the next step by looking at what people are saying. And a technique that Eric Mazur suggested is you poll students first, you see how they're doing. And if you have a really challenging question where somewhere around 40 to 70% of the class get it right, you would then have them do some peer discussion where they talk it over amongst themselves and then they'd vote again. So in the first time, you could see how they're doing. If everyone's getting it right, there's not a lot of benefit for that extensive peer discussion. If everyone's getting it wrong, then you may want to go back and do something else. But if people are falling in the middle, we're roughly half plus or minus 15, 20% are getting it right, then let them talk it over with each other and then vote again. And you can generally get a feel for how they're doing by listening to the volume of the discussion. I think you were all, well, two of you were here when we had Eric Mazur on campus, and he demonstrated that, where what he did was he showed an image of a metal plate with a hole in it, and he asked people what would happen to the size of the hole in that if you heat that plate after going through what happens as things expand when they get warmer, and the physics reasons for that. And then people voted, and then what he did is he asked people to discuss it. And he said, listen to how loud this is. And he said, if I were to lecture on what happened to the size of a hole in a metal plate when you heat it up, it would be about the most boring lecture you could have. But listen to how you're all animated and discussing this. And that's why I do this. And he said, vote again. And then he went on to the next slide, and people got angry because he didn't tell them what the answer was, because they wanted to know. It built in that curiosity because people committed to a response and they wanted to know if they were right. No matter what the topic is, it provokes some curiosity. Then you get that peer discussion. And the evidence is pretty strong that dramatically increases the amount that students learn and are able to recall. And there have been a lot of studies about this. Okay, now there's a lot of different question types. And actually, well, we don't have that many people. We could talk this one through. What are some reasons why you might want to use polling? Or what might be some advantages of using polling besides the learning gains from that?
Students just don't want to speak up in class when you ask them a question. If it's anonymous and they can just poll their answer instead, they'll be a lot more likely to respond.
Okay, they're much more likely to respond, especially the students who are more uncertain about it. And it also provides a somewhat more equitable way of doing it because there are always those students who always want to answer, whether they're right or wrong. They always are the first ones who volunteer. And there's also students who are somewhat reluctant. And it could be a lack of confidence. It could be just a personality. They're a little more shy or more cautious, or want to think things through before saying something. But with this, they all get an equal voice. And even if it's not anonymous, if you have a reasonable sized class, it feels anonymous to them. The results don't personally identify the people who made the choices. That you get to see the breakdown of the responses, but you don't see whether individual people are right or wrong. So it's not as costly psychologically to make a mistake if it's not visible to the entire class, right? So that's another reason. Any others? Well, if you just have one person, even just a few people responding to a question, you know how one or two or a few people are understanding something. You don't know if they're the only people who understand the concept, or if you don't know if they're the only people who don't understand the concept. So when you use polling, you're able to see how the whole class is doing. And not only are you knowing how the whole class is doing, they're getting to see how they're doing too. So if they think they understand something and it turns out they don't understand it quite as well, they're getting pretty immediate feedback on that. And if they, I'm going to mute there. And if they, if they're not sure if they understand it and they see they're getting it right, it can help build some confidence. But what it does is it takes a lot of that pressure off, but it's still giving us information about how students are doing, and it's still giving them information on how they're doing. And that can be really helpful in real time. And also, you can give them some immediate feedback, because once you ask the question, even before you display the results and talk about what's correct, you could ask someone who picked one answer why they chose that. You could ask others who picked a different answer why they chose it. And then you could have them question each other, or, discuss their arguments. And then you can give them some additional feedback, because we do want to provide some correction if there are correct answers. Sometimes you might be just asking opinions, and you might just have a discussion of the values or other things implicit in those decisions, in which case there may be no right answer. Other times there may be questions where there is a clear-cut answer. And again, that can be helpful in letting students know how they're doing. So here's a few other things. Let's just try this. This time, this is what we call here a multiple answer. It's sort of like the radio buttons instead of check boxes and forms. So I'm going to start the polling on this, and just pick whatever answers you think might be accurate. And some of this we already talked about a little bit.
I don't have access to the class.
You don't have what?
Yeah, I created my account, but I don't have access.
Okay, if you go to, did it ask you for a code?
No, they didn't ask me for code. I created my account as the instructor, so I can see create codes, event, AI question cells. I don't see any spot where I can like put a code or
Okay.
asking me for the code.
Are you doing this through a web app on a computer?
Yeah, computer, yes.
Okay, try clicking on the link I just put in chat and see if that will help. That should get you there.
Okay. Yeah, I'm using both my phone and computer, so let me just.
Okay, well, you should also.
I saw the link. I got that link. I just put it there, but it's not showing anything. It's like empty. I didn't use it that link that you sent. Let me just copy and send it an email. See what happens.
Yeah, the other way of doing it is if you go to there and it asks you to join SUNY Oswego, and then you should be able to search for SELT, and that might get it to you.
Okay, I'm trying that too. I'm so sorry that.
Okay. Yeah, there's a lot of background noise. So it's. Is that working? Okay, in any case.
I'm doing.
Oh. Okay. And by the way, the first time you do it in class, students will sometimes have trouble. They'll forget their password, or they won't be connecting right away because they chose a different section of the course. They chose another instructor. But it works 99% of the time, and usually you can resolve those things in the first few minutes of a class. And as we saw when Rebecca demonstrated this at the workshop on Wednesday, everyone seemed to be able to connect pretty easily to it by putting up the QR code. And you could do that. You could put up a QR code on the first thing, except again, once students sign in, they're already logged into the course, so they don't have to do quite as much. So it should make it a little bit easier. Okay, well, let's take a look at the responses so far. And it looked like of the two people who did get in, people chose all. And yes, it does help student metacognition. It lets people understand what they know and what they don't know, which is really important feedback. It gives us that real-time information. But this is something that surprises a lot of people that, if you have a big class and there's lots of people sitting in a room that may hold hundreds of people, it's really easy for people to get distracted. I know even during the workshop on Wednesday, I was sitting near the back and there was a lot of discussions going on behind me at times. And it was sometimes a little bit hard to hear. But when there's a question up there, all of a sudden it brings everyone back to focus and it pretty much resets their attention. It makes them curious. They want to know if they got the right answer or not. And then everyone quiets down right after they finish it. And that can be really helpful. And again, they've been hit with a little dose of realism. Either they're doing well and that encourages them, or they're not quite getting it, in which case they recognize that they may have to increase their focus a little bit. But it can also be used to gather information on preconceptions and prior knowledge. It's hard to help students learn new things if they already have preconceived notions about how things work, that you may have to help them break down by challenging some of those preconceptions. Because, we don't come into class as a blank slate. We all have some view about how the world works in our discipline. And this way we can get a feel for where students are at the beginning and what they already know so we can build on that. And it also allows us to do a little more just-in-time teaching, where we can focus more class time on the things that students are struggling with. And if we see that students have already picked this up and are understanding it, we don't have to spend as much time on those topics. So it lets us use class time much more efficiently, and also makes it easier to break down some of the assumptions that people have that may not be entirely accurate. And it's also a good way of helping building some community and concern. Asking students at the beginning of class how they're doing or what concerns they're having or what they're struggling with. You can get feedback from all the students and you can either respond to it in real time or come back, look through it, and then address it at the next class meeting. And that also lets you do all those CATs, the classroom assessment techniques and so forth, are often done with polling type software. Okay, now here, they did experiments in both physics classes. Eric Mazur in his physics classes, and Carl Wyman, a Nobel Prize winner in chemistry, also did some experiments here in introductory classes in both disciplines. And what they did was they tested students at the beginning of a course module and then again at the end of it. And they were standard measures that had been used in chemistry and physics for a fair amount of time. And they had classes that were taught by using clickers with this sort of approach and classes that were not. Everything else in the class was the same other than the use of the clickers. And so what they did is they compared the change in scores on the pre and post test in the control group where students did not use clickers, which were primarily in those cases just lecture classes, with the group where they use clickers. And the question is, how much more did students learn? They did learn more. Well, that would rule out question choice A, but how much more would students learn? What would be the percent improvement in the change from the pre-test to the post-test as a result of clicker use? And this now is not going to be multiple answer. This is going to be multiple choice. And we'll start the polling. And again, I don't expect you necessarily to know this, but it's an interesting statistic on how effective it seems to be. Okay, so we got everybody connected now. Good. So we can stop the polling and take a look. And actually, no one got it right. It was 200 to 300% that Eric Mazur found a tripling in the amount of improvement, that they ended up improving the scores by 3. The increase was 3 times as large in the class where clickers were used, using force concept inventories in his class, which is a standard measure of intuitive understandings of physics concepts, compared to the control group. And in chemistry, Cole-Wyman found a smaller effect of about double. But the interesting thing is in those papers, they broke down the distribution, the close to normal distribution of scores. And in both cases, the entire distribution was shifted up so that the lower tail of the clicker group overlapped with just a small part of the upper tail of the control group. So it was a really dramatic effect. Now, I should know that in many other disciplines, they've done these tests and the effects were much smaller. In fact, in a few experiments, there was no significant change in student learning. But in nearly all of the studies, the vast majority of studies, there were significant increases. The other thing people often asked is students' perception of the class and engagement and how much they felt they learned and how much they enjoyed it. And in all of the cases, there was a significant improvement in student perception of the class quality and of their learning and so forth. But in most studies, there were significant increases. I know of no studies where there was a significant decrease. It's just in some disciplines, the effect was not statistically significant. In pretty much all cases, students did better when clickers were used, but the effect wasn't always large enough. And some of that may have been class size. Some of it may have also been how they were used. Because what most of the studies have indicated is that the real learning gains come from the peer discussion and the feedback. And if instructors use it without the peer discussion, where students are arguing, debating it with each other, or without providing feedback, letting them know what's correct or not correct, there's not going to be as much of a gain. Sometimes students use it just for, sometimes instructors just use it for attendance. And, it does give you that, but it's probably not the best way of doing that. There's other ways of taking attendance. Now, it's not going to show anyone's name and it's not going to put anything in the grade book here, but I'm going to turn off the anonymous just so you can see what it looks like, because we have the option of grading things when things are correct. And I'll show you how to do that in the next one. So, here's a numeric example, a numeric question. So here I'm going to change this to a numeric question, and it's asking if there's 100 student flu cases the first week, next week, if the number of new weekly cases rises by 10% per week, how many new cases would be expected 2 weeks later? I was going to put measles in, but that's too politically sensitive. So let's just try this. Pretty simple math problem, basically. Relative. I can put in any number, it doesn't matter. Well, let's go with those two, and let's see how they are. Okay, 121, 21. And actually, some of it's a phrasing. We'd see an increase of 21, but the total number of new cases would be, I think, 121. But so in that case, you'd have the option of, depending on the interpretation, of making both of them correct, and it would grade both of them correct. One would be flagged as a correct answer, but students would get credit. So when you find if there is a correct answer, you just click on it, it marks that as correct, and you have the option of assigning different point values to correct or incorrect responses. A common practice is to give people some points just for answering and more points for answering correctly. Because if we want to have problems with a significant proportion of the class get wrong, we don't want to penalize them too much for guessing. So, a common thing is to do half of the points if they answer and full credit if they answer correctly. Or you can, what I normally do is give 3 points for any answer and 5 points for a correct answer. And if half of the questions the students get wrong, on average, they'd end up with 80 points. The whole thing is only worth 10 or 15% of the grade in most of my classes. So it's not a large share of the grade, but at least this is not going to bring their grade down. And they're getting, some points for just participating in the activity. Okay, now here's another type of question. Let me get this out of the way. This is not the best one probably to illustrate it, but was one I found around. And here, this is a question where you can just click on a portion of the graph. And this is a diagram I use in my class, but I actually do it as multiple choice because in a large class, you'll see a lot of points. But you can, in this case, you can just touch the screen and submit that. Or either with a mouse if you're on a laptop or with your screen on a mobile device. And it doesn't matter if you get it correct or not. Tap it anywhere, it doesn't matter. And no one's going to be expected to, Okay, so I'll stop the polling and let's just take a look here. And there's a display. And actually, the correct answer is here. I can make that bigger, though, I think. Let me see. Well, I think I can make it bigger. Select the region you want to mark as correct. And apparently I clicked it by mistake up there. There we go. So I'm going to go here. The correct answer that is paid by consumers is a difference in price. Well, what I would do is basically, it's this rectangle that's labeled A. And for some reason, I think I must have, there we go. You just define the area that includes it. We can give that one credits right on the margin there. And that would assign it as correct or incorrect and so forth. So we'll save that. Or you could always do it later too. You don't have to mark things correct or incorrect now. But there are some cases where this might be useful. If you're doing some type of a map quiz so that you can tell, say, the difference between Greenland and Iceland on a map so you don't get confused, when you're giving a talk, for example. Or if you're doing if you're teaching art and you want to have people highlight an area where there's a particular use of perspective or shading or something similar, you could put an image up and have people click which parts of it in that image are correct, and so on. So I very rarely use this type of question, but in some disciplines it could be useful. Okay, so again, there was that question that you were asked when you were getting your account set up, where you were asked for your clicker ID. If you're using a physical clicker, then there's a physical device with buttons on it. Those were how these things were originally generally used. They're not, it's much less common today. You still have that option, but students would have to buy the clickers, and the cost of the clickers are like $45. And then they also have to pay for a license for it. No, they don't. Given that we have the campus account, they wouldn't, but the mobile version is free. It works on Chromebooks, it works on any web connected device, on laptops, on mobile devices, smartphones, tablets, etc. So it works pretty easily, and it doesn't cost students anything. And when they're if you do lock it down to the physical clickers, they have to remember to bring it. And one of the problems we had was students would sometimes forget their clickers, but they're very unlikely to forget their phones. Another thing that we used to see back when we were using physical clickers was sometimes one student would bring in 3 or 4 clickers for themselves and 3 or 4 of their friends. And again, you'd have to have a little chat with them about academic integrity and so forth. But we don't have to worry about that so much with mobile devices, because it's very rare that a student is going to lend their smartphone to another student, because we've seen what happens when other people get hold of other students or other people's smartphones. So and also, if they're using a physical clickers, they're constrained to multiple choice. Basically, they lose all the other options. And in the iClicker Cloud, which is, I think, everyone on campus is now using. We had a few holdouts because they didn't want to allow mobile devices in their classes for reasons that were quite strong, but it just didn't work that well. We used to have to bring the software in on a USB drive, and stick it in and run it, and everything was stored there. And sometimes people forgot them, or they corrupted them, or they got wet or something, and they lost some of their data. Since it's in the cloud, you just sign in, and it's all hosted on the iClicker server, and again, integrated with Brightspace. That integration makes it really easy, because all you have to do is go through, select the correct answers, and upload them to the gradebook, and it just shows up as another column. Well, let me take that back. You have the choice of having one column for each day's clicker questions, or you could have one column that's a total number of clicker points for the whole semester. I usually recommend doing, if you're going to be using them regularly, I recommend doing one column for each day, because then they can see how they did each individual day in the grade book rather than just seeing a total. And then if they say, well, I know I was there, they can't easily see from the grade book which days they were missing or when they perhaps might have forgotten to be there or whatever. But with the grade book, you can see one column for each day, check the date, and it shows, well, you didn't connect to this on this day, etc. And it also lets us see visibly which students were in class on which days and when they were absent. This is what the physical clickers look like. I have some still in the CELT office when we used to give workshops on those. They're roughly $20 used, about $45 new. And they worked by an RF connection to a base station. And that was a bit of a problem when we went remote back in 2020, because unless you were within maybe a couple hundred feet of the classroom, it didn't work. Because I did have students, I did switch to the iClicker Cloud. Actually, I had already switched to iClicker Cloud, but some students were still using physical clickers, and they were trying to connect using the radio frequency connection from Long Island, from somewhere in Western New York, and in a couple of cases from other countries when they went back to their home country because of illness or deaths in the family and so forth. So you can do this, but I'd recommend it against it. It's more costly, batteries go dead, and you have to bring batteries or remind students to bring batteries, and it just doesn't work as smoothly. And you can't, again, use them remotely because it is a local radio frequency signal. The only advantage of the physical clickers is you don't have to deal with the distractions posed by mobile devices in classes. The mobile app can be used anywhere. It just requires a web-connected device, and it is still free for spring 2026. CTS picked up the license on this shortly after COVID to allow us to use it again remotely without imposing a cost on students. And it costs the campus, through the CTS budget, $4 per student. Now, if we stopped doing it, the cost currently is students would have to pay $16 for basically one semester. They would have to pay $25 for a year and $34.99 for 2 years, or $50 basically for 4 years. And students were doing that before we moved to the campus license. And the nice thing, though, is however it's done, the more places students use it, if students are already enrolled in one class, it doesn't cost the college anything more if they use it in other classes. And I use it in my large intro class, and typically half or more of the students are using it in more than one class. So if they're already using it someplace, it doesn't cost them any more to be used. It doesn't cost the campus any more to use it in other classes. And most instructors in the economics department use it for all classes. Originally, I started using it in large classes, but I went to a session many years ago, given by someone from iClicker, actually, talking about how they were using a class of 10 to 20 students. And the arguments they made is, again, when you ask students questions, you don't necessarily know how everyone is doing unless they all submit something, you grade it, and, or you ask each person individually to respond. Here we get those immediate responses, and most of those benefits work no matter how large the class is. And it does seem to be helpful in terms of supporting student learning. Well, these are things related to the iClicker thing, but we've already kind of addressed that. Now, there is an option for geofencing, and that's an issue that people have wanted to explore, and some people have used it. What geofencing works is you can define on a map the range at which the students should be allowed to connect, because if students are just connected over the web, they don't have to be in the same state. As long as they can see your Zoom, well, as long as they can see the questions on their screens, they can still respond to them. The concern is that students might choose to do that without physically attending. And in the large class, I have tried that a couple of times, because in 2 semesters I did see, after after the Thanksgiving break, typically, students would disappear a little bit. And then I'd say, well, we're going to have to try this again. And each time it's always caused some problems because not all the students' phones pick up the geographical location accurately enough that even if they're sitting right in front of you, it may look like they're somewhere else on campus. And then you have to help them get their location set before they can connect. And also, every time I have tried this, and I've only tried it, I think, 3 days in those 2 semesters, 2 days, one semester, and one the next. I always, my classes generally were like 250 or 260 or thereabouts students. There was always one student who had a broken leg, or one student who was in the hospital, or one student who had to leave for some sporting event, and they still wanted to participate in class. So I always ended up turning it off. And usually after you said, look, you guys are supposed to be here in class, they came back, especially after they weren't able to connect that one day. But you can try it in small classes. It can work. I know a couple of people in my department have used it successfully. But if you've got hundreds of students, I would not recommend it, other than because you're going to leave some students out or have to spend a lot of time helping them get connected. It works most of the time, probably 98, 99% of the time, but we don't want to exclude students in general. So, and that's the best practice. I already mentioned this, have students respond individually, check on responses. If there's a good proportion of students who don't have it correct, let them go through that second stage. That was developed by Eric Mazur. Do the poll again, and then have them discuss it, and then provide feedback on their arguments. And that's kind of it. So, what questions do you have?
John,
Yes.
when you earlier when you were talking about the answers being able to be made into a word cloud, how is it using that verbatim? Is it creating the word cloud verbatim to all the answers, or does it
Yes.
have enough AI
It's
in
just
this thing to summarize words?
the actual app, it's the interface that we use in class has no AI built into it. There is an AI question generator in the desktop version of the program, but it doesn't. It just uses every single word. So it'll display every word with its relative frequency, which isn't terribly useful, especially in small groups. It did work somewhat well when, there were a couple of hundred people in the room over in Park, but in general, when I ask questions like, how is everyone doing or something like that, or what challenges they have, the word cloud is often not very helpful. So, but you do have the option, by the way, of displaying all the responses, and you can scroll through it and respond in real time. Again, if you have hundreds of students, that may be a bit tough. But if people happen to have used the same responses, we'll group them and say, the number of people who said this. So if you ask them to put 2 words or 3 words, you'll see some commonality. But I generally don't use a word cloud for that reason, and I'll just scroll down and address some of the things they said, may offer some suggestions when people say, well, I'm having trouble with this, or, or the math is difficult, or, I have trouble understanding graphs. These are things that come up every time in an intro class, no matter how much support we provide. And, just say, well, this is a really common problem. You're not alone. Look, however, how many other people are struggling with the same thing, which is another good benefit of polling. That, often when students find they're having trouble with something, they think they're the only ones who are struggling with it, and letting them see that this is a really common problem that other students are experiencing makes them feel a little bit better about it. And then we can focus a bit more effort on those things. So, and tell them, you may not understand this now, but you're going to be getting a lot of practice on this. So by the end of the term, you're going to be a lot more comfortable with this than you are at the start, which is why you're in this class, so that you can learn and develop these skills. So, but putting it on display makes it a little bit easier. It helps build more of a sense of connection. I love using clickers. I know of only one student, one instructor who started using it and stopped. Everyone else I know of, once they did it the first time, they've been doing it every time since then. And the one person who did it I'm not sure quite why, they just didn't like it. They didn't like the fact that they had to cut off the responses at some point, et cetera. But that was only one person, and that person retired about 4 or 5 years ago. So I've been using them probably 12, 13 years now in different forms. But iClicker is a really good platform. And it is one of
You
the two
said
or
that
three who's coming.
you said that I guess the app is connected to the cloud and internet service and so forth. I remember it was back in October last year when there was a big Amazon cloud kerfuffle that like knocked out half of the country. Did the iClickers get affected by that?
No. By coincidence, I'm not sure where it's hosted, but they were not affected by that. I know it affected many, many things, including, didn't it affect the authentication system on campus, and um, I don't remember which services, but we lost some services on campus.
Everything, I think yeah,
It may
it was
have,
pretty
yeah.
bad.
Yeah, but iClicker still work. There have only been, I've been using the iClicker thing for probably 10 or 11 of those years. We used a different platform before that, but I think there was only one day where I experienced problems that were caused by problems on their server. They've been remarkably stable. The only problems I had historically was we used to have a lot of network problems where back when my classes were generally like 350 to 420 students, it was often hard for all of them to connect at once because we just didn't have enough Wi-Fi connections in Lanigan to handle all those at once. And that was a problem when everyone tried when you have 400 and some students trying to connect through a very limited number of that connection points, it got jammed up and it would delay it. So, you know, I haven't seen that problem because we've upgraded the wireless, the bandwidth is much greater, the connection speeds are much faster. I have not had any persistent problems with student connections. Generally, in a class of last semester, I had about 250 or so. There was one student who had trouble connecting, but they had trouble connecting their phone to the network everywhere. It wasn't specific to this. So, in general, the network problems have pretty much disappeared the last few years, which is a huge relief because that was a major barrier. And I know Greg used to come over regularly and check the network, check how many people were connecting. And I remember one time I asked people to raise their hands if they were having connections problems, and it was 1/4 of the class all concentrated in the same area where there was apparently a dead hot spot, basically. So that got fixed, and it's been working pretty well since then. So in general, it's been a really reliable service. But you never know if that's going to continue. We might see some problems with other cloud servers as that industry becomes more and more concentrated, with Amazon taking up a huge share of that. Because OpenAI is getting a lot of cloud services from, I think Microsoft might still be using Amazon too. And, there's a lot of things going out on the internet now, and much of it is concentrated on a very small number of cloud service providers. Any other questions? If you have any questions, I'm happy to help you. We always do some sessions on setting it up. In fact, the session after next is how to set up an account. Basically, what I'll be doing is I'll be going through my class and setting it up for class beginning on Monday to show you what the steps are to connect the gradebook and to set up the parameters and what the settings mean and what your choices are and how you can vary those. I think the next session is on using the AI question generator. If you're curious about that, that's a really short introduction. But okay, well, thank you. And if you ever have any questions, I enjoy working with this, and it's a lot of fun, and students generally enjoy it too. So, thank you.
Thanks, John.
Thank you.